Chapter 4, the Sermon on the Mount. Of Part 4, but it's chapter 20 of the book as a whole. Having set apart his chosen ambassadors, it remained that Jesus should set forth the principles of his religion, give some such evidence of his divine right to teach as should be able to move the generation around him and impart his spirit to those who were to infuse it into this world. He proceeded at once to this work. The first movement was the delivery of a discourse, which has been known generally as the Sermon on the Mount, reports of which are furnished us by Matthew and Luke, near Capernaum, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. It would require as much, a larger volume than this, to give the literature which has grown around the questions of the time and place of delivery of the sermon, and whether Matthew and Luke report the same or different discourses, and the literature of the sermon itself would make a library quite respectable in point of size. It is clear that much must be condensed. The place was a mountain. It could not have been very far from the lake. The earliest tradition of the spot is as late as the middle of the 13th century. That makes it what is now called the Horns of Hattin, because between Tiberias and Mount Tabor, 7 miles from Capernaum, in a southwesterly direction, Dr. Robertson, Researches 2, page 307, gives the following description of this spot. The road passes down to Hattin on the west of the tell. As we approached, we turned off from the path toward the right in order to ascend the eastern horn. As seen on this side, the tell or mountain is merely a low ridge, some 30 or 40 feet in height, and not 10 minutes in length from east to west. At its eastern end is an elevated point or horn, perhaps 60 feet above the plain, and at the western end another, not so high. These give to the ridge, at a distance, the appearance of a saddle, and are called Kurun Hattin, the Horns of Hattin. But the singularity of the ridge is that on reaching the top, you find that it lies at the very border of the Great Southern Plain, where this latter sinks off at once by a precipitous offset to the lower plain of Hattin, from which the northern side of Tell rises very steeply, not much less than 400 feet. Mount Hattin and the Sea of Galilee. So let's get a better look at the art. The summit of the eastern horn is a little circular plain, and the top of the lower ridge between the two horns is also flattened to a plain. The whole mountain is of limestone. Dr. Stanley's Sinai and Palestine, page 360, gives the following. The tradition of the Latin Church, which selects this spot as the Mount of Beatitudes, cannot lay claim to any early date. It was in all probability suggested first to the Crusaders by its remarkable situation, but that situation so strikingly coincides with the intimations of gospel narrative as almost to force the inference that in this instance the eye of those who selected the spot was for once rightly guided. It is the only height seen in this direction from the shores of the lake Gennesaret. The plain on which it stands is easily accessible from the lake, and from that plain to the summit is but a few minutes' walk. The platform at the top is evidently suitable for the collection of a multitude, and corresponds precisely to the level place. Tapu Prinu is translated plain in Luke 6:17, to which he would come down as from one of its higher horns to address the people. Its situation is central both to the peasants of the Galilean hills and the fishermen of the Galilean lake, between which it stands, and would therefore be a natural resort both to Jesus and his disciples, Matthew 4:25 and 5:1, when they retired for solitude from the shores of the sea, and also to the crowds who assembled from Galilee to Decapolis, from Jerusalem to Judea, and from beyond Jordan. None of the other mountains in the neighborhood could answer equally well to this description, inasmuch as they are merged into the uniform barrier of hills round the lake, or as this stands separate, the mountain which could alone lay claim to a distinct name, with the exception of the one height of Tabor, which is too distant to answer the requirements. The question as to whether the discourse beginning in the 5th chapter of Matthew and that in the 6th of Luke be different or identical is quite perplexing, as there seems to be grave objections to both suppositions. That they are identical is believed by most readers upon a superficial inspection, and is maintained generally by most German commentators. And I think that some of the Bible translations would have minimized the apparent differences between what's said here and what's said there, right? And then efforts must be made to explain the differences which occur in the two. In Luke, we have about 1/3 of the matter given by Matthew, 4 of the Beatitudes being balanced by 4 woes, as Dean Alford notices, and some introductory sayings are recorded which do not appear in Matthew. That they are 2 different discourses is held by a number of writers, and among them Greswell, Dissertation 26. Against this, it is urged as improbable that he should have delivered 2 distinct discourses so nearly alike, and both so near the beginning of his public ministry. The beginnings and the conclusions in both discourses agree. They seem to be the same and different. Matthew tells us that this sermon was delivered on a mount. Luke, that it was on a plain. If both histories be read carefully and without prejudice, I think the following will occur to the reader as the probable state of the case. Well, there was the Essene teacher of wickedness, and there's reference to the Essene teacher of righteousness, and more political were these titles, but yeah. What we find reported by Matthew and Luke must have been delivered during the same journey through Galilee and the close of that journey. What Luke reports, if it be not the same, must have been delivered immediately after the discourse Matthew gives, but his report is so connected as to compel the abandonment of the theory that it is a number of the apophthegms delivered at different times, recollected by Matthew and strung together. The people had gathered in great crowds about Jesus. He went up into the mountain. His disciples came to him. Others must have accompanied his disciples. He delivered the discourse which is begun in Matthew 5:3. When that was completed, he commenced to descend the mountain. On the plateau below, he found greater multitudes. He repeated some things he had just spoken, and added others, making together the speech which begins in Luke 6:20. It is not right to speak of the former as esoteric and the latter as exoteric. There was nothing of that style in Jesus. All is outspoken truth, such as truth as individual man in every stage of culture need. But it is to be admitted to his more select and friendly audience. He should have spoken more freely of the scribes and Pharisees than to a promiscuous assemblage. This statement of the case is at least a natural one, as all who have preached to crowds in rural districts must know, and consists with all the major and minor incidents related to by both historians. It's not quite the word. It agrees too with the physical condition of the Mount of Beatitudes. If that selected by tradition to be the mount as descriptions given above exhibit especially the passage from Dr. Robertson, which is italicized. It agrees with such incidents as this. Matthew says that he sat, Luke that he stood, and the former he naturally would do on rising ground.